We've got Wade Baker from Verizon Business, and you're going to cover today the last segment of the Verizon DBIR 2010, covering what?
So we're covering the what takes place after a breach. So the whole response, recovery process, all of those kinds of things, which is where a lot of the hangups take place. Of course, the breach is bad enough, but what happens after that is also not so great news. So just as a review, I don't know if everybody has been here week to week, but we kind of started off with a little overview of the whole report. We talked about next week who was behind these breaches, the threat agents we call them. Last week we spent talking about the attacks, how the incidents take place, methods used, all those kinds of things. And this week, like I said, it's really the response process. And I don't know if you have a report, electronic copy, but we're looking at this little bubble chart on page 46 of the report, just in case you have one electronic copy nearby or something like that. But what it's talking about is a timeline of the typical incident. And there's lots of ways that you could look at this, obviously, and you could carve up a timeline of an incident in as many different discrete points as you really feel like. But we have three main categories, and we use point of entry to compromise. In other words, from the time that the criminal breaks through your perimeter till the time that they actually compromise data. And why do we measure it that way? A lot of people ask, why not from their initial attack? Well, really, it has a lot to do with logs. So we're talking about forensic investigations here. So our real picture into what's going on starts when logs start capturing things. And that's usually when they start hitting up against the perimeter or they start bouncing around inside the network. So that's why that segment is there. And the next is from compromise of data to when the victim discovers it. And the third phase is the discovery point to the time that the breach is contained, which usually means locking down data going out the door. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about some of those things in depth, because there's just some really interesting insights in this. And as a matter of fact, I don't think we say this in the report, but back when we first started talking about what metrics we wanted to collect for this study, this came up, and we were thinking of it more in just describing the attack. In other words, we were interested in these phases to know how the attack took place and just kind of basic response type things. And it kind of surprised us all that I think this is one of the most interesting areas of the report, just in terms of its what it says about the state of practice in our organizations, where it identifies that we really need to change some things and improve our capabilities and processes. And I was really glad to see that, because I'll be honest, it was somewhat of a surprise that it had those kinds of things to say. So let's just take the first segment, point of entry to compromise. And again, what we're doing here is how long did that take? And typically it takes days, weeks, hours, in that range. 31% took place within minutes, which is pretty quick. But the rest of them, start out toward days and weeks and months even. So if that is true, granted, some events are over and done before we really could respond to them, about a third of events, unless we have extremely quick reaction time. But the rest of them, the majority of them, it's really telling me that we have some time. Our IDS doesn't have to be a one-shot and done thing, and if it doesn't recognize it right as it's happening, then we're done for. It looks like we have some time to analyze logs and even do batch processing, and at the end of the day check to see what was going on, because if we have days to check it, then we can do a few more layers of analysis. And I think that's good news to us all, because it's hard to recognize these things on the sort of a real-time scale. So that's one thing I take away from it. A lot of people look at that and they think, wow, these attacks are taking place really quickly. But I kind of see it a little bit differently, that we do have some time to react and thinking about what can we do to improve that reaction. Because again, remember that these are all breach victims, so none of these were caught before the event took place. We do have examples of that. We have some events that we were called in to investigate that when we do the investigation, we realize that the organization did respond adequately. And so those organizations are not in this caseload. But these are all ones where the mechanisms did fail and there was an incident. So that's an interesting phase. I think the most interesting, though, is the compromise to discovery. And over all 3 years that we've done this report, there's been a lot of discussion around this, a lot of interest from people when they read it. Presentations like this usually have questions in this area. But the time that it takes from a company when they're compromised to when they discover it is on average somewhere in the order of 4 or 5 months. That's dropped from 6 or 7 months in the past few years, so it's dropping a little bit. But still, 4 or 5 months is a long time to have a breach go unknown to an organization. Longer the breach is open, the more data is going out, and of course the bigger the problem gets and the nastier all of these things go. So, what is going on in that, I think, is just an interesting thing to consider. In this report, 37%, by the way, took months or more. 45% took months or more. Again, the average 4 or 5 months. But that's, I want to hold on why that's happening just till we get done talking about the next time phase. But just keep in mind, long window of time from compromise to discovery. So, okay, discovery has happened. The organization knows about this breach. Now what? And in some ways, this may be even more shocking than the compromise to discovery. The fact that it's still taking weeks on average for an organization once they know about a breach till the time they can shut it down. And you think about that, it's bad enough that the breach has happened. It's bad enough that we've let it go on unknown for so long, and then we add on a couple more weeks to that window of exposure. Just kind of makes a bad story worse. But a lot of that has to do with response plans. We find out that these organizations don't really have a plan in place, or maybe they have a plan on paper, but nobody really knows about it. So a typical response goes, something like this, and I'm not trying to make fun of any organizations, but just think about, would this happen to us? Is the point of the story. Find out about the breach. There's a meeting to discuss how we should respond and who we should call, and maybe there's one person that knows the law enforcement contact or who's going to investigate. So there's some discussion within the organization until we find out who to contact. There's some what do we do? A lot of organizations, if you think about this as an evidence scene and how much crime scenes are preserved in the physical world, people know not to touch evidence and all of that kind of thing. In the electronic world, it doesn't transfer so much. People start moving machines and wiping them and destroying evidence, and there's a lot of that going on, not really sure what to do. So it's clear that there's the planning and hey, what should we do to both respond to the incident, preserve evidence, to allow us to figure out what happened, and all of these kinds of things tend to not be so worked out. And that's certainly an issue. There's a lot of time wasted during trying to figure that out. But so we do a lot of recommendations on have a plan. Do mock trials of incident response. If you have a team in your organization to do that, then do a few tests and see how it goes, because there's always hiccups that you don't expect every single time. So that window could certainly be shrinked just by better planning and coordination and all of those kind of things, preparation. So let me move on here to the compromise to discovery again. It's taking a while to discover. And I think the question is raised, well, how are these things discovered? Is it our discovery processes that are finding them? In other words, intrusion detection, log analysis, auditing, things like that. And if you haven't read the report, you might be surprised to know that it's usually not an internal discovery. Those processes are actually fairly rare in terms of the method of discovery, which is unfortunate. It's something to work on. Most often, it's a third party calling up and saying, if it's a payment card breach, for instance, very often it's the credit card company calling and saying, fraud patterns are alerting us that several transactions that took place at your location within a certain window of time point to the fact that you might be a victim of a compromise. Please have that investigated. A lot of times law enforcement will call up and they have a lot of underground things going on where they're looking for bad guys selling data. And so one of them might try to sell, hey, I stole data from so-and-so, do you want to buy it? And law enforcement will notify that organization that they're likely a victim of a compromise. So things like that are more often the mode of an organization coming to know they've been breached than the things that we put in place to find that out. And we do, again, a lot of discussion about why that is in the report. Why isn't log analysis working? Why isn't intrusion detection working? Some of that is just the nature of the attack. We talked about in the attack section, a lot of these things are exploiting weaknesses in authentication and authorization, and those are harder to see for things that rely on a signature or things that are supposed to look suspicious. And so that's one reason, but a lot of these companies just don't have these things turned on, or they're turned on almost to satisfy a checkbox in an auditor for an auditor, but nobody's ever looking at the logs. Nobody's running them. The IDS systems are turned down so far because there's too many false positives and nobody's listening to them. So there's a lot of things going on here, and it's a huge problem. I really would say that this is one of the fundamental challenges, I think, of being able to recognize and respond to incidents in a timely manner is a real challenge. But we try to make some recommendations and would love to hear your thoughts if you've got some experiences there. Or you can have a conversation on our blog or however you'd like. But this is an interesting area.
Well, Wade, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to be with us these last 3 or 4 weeks.